So I recently bought this 2001 Honda Civic, and this is a D17A2 motor, 1.7 litre. What I usually do with every car that I buy is I do tests on it to see what the health is like. Now, everyone will probably be familiar with this gauge here as a compression gauge, and what this actually does is measure the amount of pressure in the combustion chamber as the piston comes up. But what I have here is a Leakdown Tester. Now, this is a completely different tool, and it tests the cylinder in a completely different way. So it works in a similar way to a compression tester, in that you have this threaded end on a piece of hose. This piece here clips into this fitting here. It's just like a normal airline fitting. You have to take your coils or your leads off, and then your spark plugs out, and you just simply screw this in and then hook this pipe onto that fitting. The thing with this test though is that you have to have the piston up at what's called the TDC, which means the top dead center, which is where the piston does all the work. So that's where the number of the piston or cylinder that you're testing is right at the top of its compression stroke, and in theory it would have fuel and it would be sparking, ready to make the ignition sequence, and then to push the piston down and then to rotate the motor. So here we can see a representation of what's actually inside the motor. So your crankshaft would be here, then this part is the conrod, and you've got your piston. Now these three lines represent your piston rings. This is obviously ring number 1, ring number 2, and here is where you have your oil rings. So these here are the valves in the actual motor. These are what the camshaft acts on ultimately, and so the valves have seats on them that make them seal, and the piston rings push against the cylinder wall, and that's what makes that seal. Now, when you do a compression test will test the amount of air the piston can compress from its lower position here to this position here. This is just the theory diagram. It is actually represented different in the motor. So what actually happens is when the piston moves up, pushes all the air and squeezes it into the chamber, and then you get your ignition, and then it pushes the piston down. So that's what the compression tester will show you, is that how effectively the piston and the rotating assembly can compress that air ready to combust. What we get from a leak-down test is that when this is in its top position, this is usually where the piston will hover around the top, because it will, when it goes to its top, the crankshaft will rock, and the piston will spend quite a lot of time in the top of the cylinder. So therefore we get a lot of wear around here, and that's where the rings wear out. The valves themselves as well, so if you can imagine a V cut out for the valve, the valve seats where they seal against, over time, particularly the exhaust one, will get pitted, and they will start to leak and things like that. So what the leak-down tester enables us to test is how well all of that is actually sealing. Now, the best thing about a leak-down tester is that if you do have a valve leaking or you do have a rings leaking, you'll actually hear it, and air will actually bypass the motor. So if you've got one cylinder or numerous cylinders that are low in compression, you can put a compression tester on, and even the compression tester, even if it's like 5 or 10 psi out, you still might think it's fine. But if you put a leak-down tester on, you might find that you've got a burn ring, or you've got a damaged cylinder wall, or even you'll hear the air coming out of the exhaust valve. And that's where really the leak-down tester comes into its own real special right there, because you can more effectively diagnose exactly what's wrong with the motor. So what I'm going to do now is I'll go ahead and remove all this stuff, and I'll get the spark plugs out and we can do the first test. So I just screw this guy in here. So the next part we do is we get our gauge and we hook up our compressed air source. We'll see this is the supply pressure, and this is the cylinder leakage. Now we do have to set this every time because every air source is a little bit different, and you'll see it move. Just turn this air valve and calibrate it till it goes into the set. Just do it slowly because there's usually a bit of lag in it. So actually try to get it between 0 and 5. And then the next step, we get this connection, and push those together. And there we have a cylinder leakage. As you can see, this is pretty good. This motor is in really good condition. This motor's done 130,000 kilometers, and it does work really well. So then after we've done that, just disconnect, move to the next cylinder, and put that cylinder at top dead center. I usually do this by using like a TIG welding rod with a bit of tape on it, and just turn the crankshaft till it comes to the top and it rocks, and then do the same for the rest of the cylinders. And that's how we do a leak down test.